At 5:42 a.m. on June 14th, 1941, in a quiet clearing beside a line of canvas tents near the French coast, Private Daniel Cross stood perfectly still with a bow drawn tight against his cheek. The early morning fog drifted low over the camp, wrapping the tables, ammo crates, and stacked helmets in a ghostly haze. His breath came out in short, controlled puffs. A thin film of dew clung to his helmet. On the table beside him lay a row of wooden arrows handmade, fletched with trimmed feathers, the kind no modern soldier expected to see in a war fought with machine guns and mortars. Two soldiers walking past slowed to a stop, staring at him like they were watching a circus act. "Come on, Cross," one muttered, half laughing. "This is 1941, not the Middle Ages." The other shook his head. "You really planning to bring that thing into a fight?" Cross didn't answer. He eased the bowstring back a hair farther, the laminated limbs creaking softly as he felt the tension settle perfectly into his right shoulder. The bow looked old, almost primitive, but every detail, every strip of wood, every inch of waxed string had been shaped by his own hands. He had built it at home in Montana, long before the war, long before anyone imagined German commandos would be slipping through the hedgerows at night, killing American sentries without making a sound. A sergeant strode by, glancing at the weapon with open irritation. "You fire that thing out there, and the only sound we'll hear is you dying," he snapped. But Cross barely reacted. His right hand was still bruised from an accident 2 days earlier, making it painful to grip a rifle stock for long. He'd adapted the only way he knew how, using the skill his father had drilled into him since childhood: silent shooting. No flash, no echo, no chance of alerting a patrol. A breeze swept through the camp, carrying the faint crackle of a radio operator calling in reports. Sightings of German infiltrators moving through the hedgerows, cutting wires, eliminating outposts. The unit had already lost 3 men in the last week. Every shot fired in the dark only invited retaliation. The Germans were ghosts, heavily trained, heavily armed, and terrifyingly close. Cross let the bowstring relax and lowered the weapon. His grip was steady, his breathing calm. "No noise," he whispered under his breath. No light, no trace. Behind him, another soldier scoffed. "Yeah? And what's that gonna do against commandos?" Cross slid an arrow from the table, its steel tip catching a glint of gray morning light. What he didn't say, what nobody in the camp could have imagined, was that within 6 days, this quiet, medieval weapon would eliminate 27 German commandos without a single gunshot being heard, and it would begin sooner than anyone expected. At 6:18 a.m. on June 14th, 1941, the fog over the Normandy tree line began to thin, revealing the faint silhouettes of hedgerows stretching across the landscape like dark, uneven walls that seemed to swallow sound and distort distance in unsettling ways. The camp was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, too controlled, too purposeful, as if the entire field was holding its breath while waiting for something unseen to crawl out of the morning haze. As Cross moved along the narrow path between the tents, the damp canvas brushed his shoulder and left streaks of cold moisture on his sleeve, making the air feel heavier than it should in the early light. The reports had started small, just scattered whispers from night patrols claiming they'd seen shadows slipping through the brush, but those whispers had quickly grown into confirmed sightings of German commandos operating far closer to the American perimeter than anyone expected at this stage of the campaign. The hedgerows made these infiltrators almost impossible to track, forming natural corridors where an entire squad could move silently, unseen, and surround an isolated sentry before he ever realized he was being hunted. Every man in the unit knew the stories patrols disappearing without gunfire, bodies found with cut throats, radios smashed, and supply lines quietly severed under the cover of darkness. Cross paused beside a stack of ammunition crates, listening to the muted rumble of distant artillery from the east, a reminder that the front line was fluid and unpredictable, constantly shifting with each German attempt to push deeper into Allied territory. The tension hung over the camp like a tightening rope, pulling men closer to paranoia as they tried to decide whether the rustling branches behind them were the wind or something far more dangerous. Even the seasoned NCOs had begun glancing over their shoulders, speaking in tones lower than usual, as if raising their voices might somehow invite the enemy closer. Near the radio tent, a corporal hunched over a crackling field set, repeating coordinates that placed hostile movement only a few hundred yards beyond the next hedgerow wall. His voice trembled despite his attempts to hide it, and the operator beside him tapped the receiver with growing frustration as the signal flickered in and out because the Germans had begun cutting communication lines during the night. Cross watched them work for several seconds, silently absorbing the fear behind their rushed movements, understanding that every warning they relayed meant the enemy was tightening a noose around the American position. A column of smoke rose in the distance from a burning farmhouse, rumored to have been used by another platoon the previous evening, and the charred smell drifted faintly into the camp, mixing with the morning dew to create a heavy, metallic scent that settled in the throat. Cross knew the Germans preferred to strike before sunrise, using the low light to conceal their silhouettes and confuse their targets, turning the terrain itself into an advantage. As he studied the hedgerows, he sensed the presence of hidden eyes watching from the other side, waiting for the moment the Americans would misstep or expose a weakness. The camp's quiet routine was slowly unraveling as soldiers checked their rifles with deliberate urgency, tightened straps on their gear, and scanned the tree line with uneasy glances that betrayed the fear simmering behind their disciplined facade. This wasn't the chaos of open battle. It was the suffocating anticipation of a threat designed to kill silently and vanish before anyone could fire a shot. Cross understood that whatever was coming would require more than standard doctrine or loud firepower, because the enemy they faced now moved like shadows, struck like phantoms, and left nothing but silence in their wake. The tension inside the camp thickened noticeably as the sun struggled to push through the heavy morning haze, creating an atmosphere where every sound felt amplified and every movement seemed unusually deliberate, pushing Cross into a mental state where instinct battled constantly with uncertainty. Behind him, several soldiers argued in hushed but frantic tones about the previous night's patrol, describing how they heard branches snap just beyond the hedgerow, yet found nothing but crushed grass and faint boot impressions that vanished before anyone could follow the trail. Their words blended with the intermittent crackle of the radio, forming a chaotic rhythm that made it difficult for Cross to separate real threats from the creeping anxiety settling into his mind. A sergeant strode past with a cigarette clenched between his teeth, barking clipped orders for the men to tighten perimeter defenses and rotate watch positions faster than usual, believing the Germans were deliberately probing for weak spots. His frustration spilled into every command, carrying an edge that reflected the growing fear beneath his hardened exterior, and several younger soldiers responded with shaky affirmations that betrayed their struggle to maintain composure. Cross watched their strained faces and realized that morale was eroding more quickly than anyone wanted to admit, especially now that the Commandos seemed to be moving with unnerving precision. Near the supply tent, two privates inspected a torn section of barbed wire that had been cut cleanly sometime during the night, whispering nervously about how the enemy must have slipped within yards of their sleeping positions without triggering a single alarm. Their discovery spread quickly through the camp, infecting conversations with a kind of whispered dread that rippled from tent to tent, leaving men glancing constantly over their shoulders, as if expecting a figure in black to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Cross felt the weight of that fear pressing against his thoughts, reminding him that these infiltrators were not ordinary troops, but highly trained operatives, skilled in silent killing and rapid disappearances. As he approached the central path again, Cross heard the sharp clatter of a dropped ammunition box, followed by a string of curses from the corporal who had fumbled the load because his hands were trembling. The noise caused several soldiers to spin toward the tree line with weapons half raised, demonstrating how jumpy the entire platoon had become under the constant threat of sudden, unseen violence. Even routine tasks had begun to feel dangerous, with every unexpected sound prompting a flinch or a momentary freeze that revealed how deeply the enemy's tactics were affecting their psychological stability. Inside the command tent, an officer hunched over a map peppered with red pencil marks indicating suspected German infiltration routes. Muttering that the hedgerows provided natural choke points the Americans could neither predict nor effectively control. His inability to formulate a reliable defense plan added another layer of stress for the platoon, who relied on clear direction to steady their nerves during uncertain moments. Cross, standing just outside the tent flap, could sense the officer's frustration and recognized that the pressure was rising faster than the leadership could manage, creating a dangerous gap between command expectations and battlefield reality. The chaos was not only external. Cross felt it tightening inside him like a coiled wire, intensified by the lingering ache in his injured right hand that throbbed each time he instinctively reached for the grip of his rifle. His inability to handle the weapon properly added a personal layer of vulnerability that gnawed at him, because he knew the Germans would exploit any weakness during a close encounter. Each pulse of pain reminded him that he was not fighting at full capacity, forcing him to consider alternative methods of survival that diverged sharply from the standard procedures drilled into every soldier. All around him, men scrambled to reinforce their positions, check weapon bolts, and reposition sandbags, creating a chorus of stressed footsteps and clipped conversations that made the camp feel like a tightening trap rather than a secure base. The frantic energy pulsing through the platoon blended with Cross's internal turmoil, forming a combined weight that pressed heavily on his thoughts and pushed him toward a decision he had avoided making until now. As he scanned the tree line and listened to the rising tension around him, he realized that the enemy had already succeeded in throwing the unit into disarray, and the only way to regain any control would be to break from the predictable path everyone else followed. In that mounting storm of fear, confusion, and escalating pressure, Cross understood that his unusual skill might soon become the only advantage they had left. According to every field manual the platoon had studied since arriving in France, the correct method for countering an infiltration threat relied entirely on overwhelming firepower, applied with speed, coordination, and strict adherence to established formations designed to control chaos before it could spread. The doctrine emphasized that small enemy teams, no matter how skilled or elusive, could be neutralized by rapid volleys from M1 rifles, synchronized flanking maneuvers, and aggressive forward pressure meant to break their momentum before they secured a foothold inside Allied lines. Instructors repeatedly stressed that silence was the enemy and sound was the ally, because a storm of gunfire supposedly disrupted even the most disciplined commando units long enough to force a retreat or reveal their concealed positions. The training reinforced a predictable sequence: advance in staggered intervals, identify movement, fire 3 to 5 rounds, relocate immediately, and maintain continuous communication to prevent gaps that infiltrators might exploit. Every soldier in the platoon could recite the steps from memory, having practiced them countless times on open fields where every command echoed clearly and every maneuver unfolded exactly as intended. Textbook patrols moved like clockwork, with crisp hand signals, tightly controlled spacing, and rapid target acquisition that gave the illusion of perfect control over an unpredictable environment. Yet the hedgerows of Normandy were nothing like the training grounds back home, because the thick walls of brush distorted sound, blocked sightlines, and swallowed muzzle flashes before they could travel beyond a few yards. The manual never accounted for conditions where a squad could fire a full magazine into the darkness and still have no idea whether the rounds hit anything other than wet leaves and tangled branches. Nor did it address situations where enemy operatives could move silently enough to flank a firing line without triggering a single alarm or disturbing so much as a patch of damp soil beneath their boots. The prescribed procedures also assumed that American units would have reliable communication, but the German commandos frequently severed telephone wires and jammed radio channels, leaving squads isolated in scattered pockets of confusion where doctrinal discipline became difficult to maintain. Without clear coordination, the fire and move sequence became dangerously chaotic, creating blind spots between hedgerows where commandos could slip through unnoticed and strike from angles the manual never mentioned. Every soldier felt the growing realization that the procedures they depended on were beginning to work against them, feeding panic rather than promoting control. Cross observed these shortcomings with increasing clarity as he watched his squad rehearse the same techniques that had failed repeatedly during the past week, recognizing how each step created noise the Germans could exploit to track movements and predict responses. He noticed how the sharp clack of bolts cycling, the metallic ring of grenade pins, and the heavy crunch of boots on thick undergrowth formed a trail of clues that any experienced infiltrator could follow effortlessly. The more the platoon relied on prescribed tactics, the more obvious their location became, turning them into unwitting beacons for the silent hunters waiting just beyond the hedgerow walls. Even the sergeants, who normally enforced doctrine with unwavering strictness, had begun to acknowledge its limitations, glancing nervously at the tree line whenever they ordered the men to fire warning shots or reposition along designated sectors. Their voices carried an uncertain edge that betrayed their growing fear that the Germans were studying every predictable maneuver and adjusting accordingly, treating the Americans' rigid training as a roadmap rather than an obstacle. Cross could feel the tension deepening with each passing hour, pressing against the thin boundary separating discipline from desperation, as the men struggled to maintain faith in a system that clearly faltered under real battlefield conditions. As he watched the squad perform another textbook drill, Cross felt the heavy weight of inevitability settling across his thoughts, realizing that the manual offered no guidance for the kind of warfare unfolding around them. There were no pages describing how to counter an enemy who refused to make noise, who struck with surgical precision, and who vanished before any soldier could react. In that moment, he understood that their survival would require something entirely different from the doctrine drilled into them, something quieter, stranger, and far more unconventional than anything written in the Army's official playbook. The deeper the platoon pushed into the Normandy hedgerows, the clearer it became that the battlefield itself was turning their doctrine into a liability, twisting every familiar tactic into a dangerous exposure that the German commandos exploited with unnerving precision. The thick walls of vegetation trapped sound in unpredictable pockets, causing rifle shots to echo back at strange angles that confused the Americans, while guiding enemy infiltrators directly toward their firing positions. Each time a patrol discharged a weapon, even in warning or reaction, the muffled blast acted like a beacon inside the maze-like terrain, inviting the commandos to converge on the source before the squad could relocate effectively. The hedgerows also compressed movement into narrow, unavoidable paths that forced the Americans to travel in predictable lines, allowing the Germans to set ambush points with chilling accuracy and wait patiently for unsuspecting soldiers to stumble into their silent traps. Even routine steps felt amplified by the damp brush beneath their boots, making stealth almost impossible and leaving trails that trained infiltrators could follow without difficulty. In contrast, the Germans moved like they had rehearsed within this terrain for years, slipping through gaps in the foliage with a quiet grace that made them seem less like soldiers and more like shadows weaving through natural corridors. During one patrol, a single misinterpreted rustle caused an entire squad to unload several rapid shots into the darkness, only to discover later that their rounds had struck nothing but a cluster of soaked brambles, giving the commandos ample time to reposition behind them. The manual insisted that firepower would suppress an enemy advance. Yet in this environment, each burst of sound merely fed panic and revealed positions, making the Americans feel increasingly exposed with every pull of the trigger. Soldiers who once trusted their rifles now hesitated before firing, fearing that the noise would draw an unseen blade rather than scare away a threat. Compounding the issue, the Germans often deployed dogs trained to detect the scent and sound of isolated sentries, allowing them to identify weaknesses in the perimeter with astonishing speed while remaining completely silent themselves. Whenever a sentry fired in self-defense, the dogs led the commandos directly to the location within seconds, turning any attempt at resistance into a death sentence for the man trying desperately to survive the attack. This terrifying dynamic created a chilling realization that every noise made by the Americans, whether deliberate or accidental, became ammunition for the enemy rather than a deterrent. Even the weather conspired against them, because the dense morning fog clung to the hedgerows like wet cotton, absorbing muzzle flashes and obscuring movement in ways that prevented the Americans from confirming whether their shots hit anything at all. The inability to visually verify their engagements eroded confidence with each encounter, forcing soldiers to operate under the constant suspicion that unseen eyes were studying them from a few yards away, waiting for the next mistake. The manual had strongly emphasized visual confirmation, yet the battlefield now provided almost none, leaving the men to fight half-blind against an enemy who seemed to thrive in the darkness. Within the platoon, conversations grew increasingly subdued, as soldiers admitted quietly that their standard rifles felt more like liabilities than tools of survival in such constrained and unforgiving terrain. A single gunshot could endanger an entire fire team, transforming the loud crack of a weapon into a desperate gamble that rarely produced the intended outcome. Cross listened to these murmurs as he evaluated his surroundings, sensing the mounting desperation behind each confession and recognizing how deeply the fear of noise had infiltrated their collective mindset. Every failed engagement reinforced a devastating truth. Traditional doctrine offered no meaningful advantage against an enemy who refused to reveal themselves through sound, movement, or predictable tactics. The platoon was stuck in a deadly paradox where firing a weapon meant courting death, yet remaining silent offered no guarantee of safety against opponents trained to slip through defenses with surgical precision. In that tightening vice of fear and helplessness, Cross realized that the only path forward required abandoning everything the manual insisted upon, embracing instead a form of warfare defined by quiet intention rather than explosive force. It was in that dawning clarity shaped by failure, fear, and the changing nature of the battlefield that the necessity for a silent solution finally emerged. Cross's unusual calm amid the tightening fear came from a life shaped far from the structured routines of military training, rooted instead in the rugged hills of western Montana, where silence was not merely a tactic, but a fundamental requirement for daily survival. Growing up on the outskirts of a small logging town, he learned early how to move through dense forests without snapping twigs or disturbing underbrush, relying on instinct and patience rather than force or speed. His father, a quiet but relentless hunter, believed that a person's value in the wild depended on their ability to disappear into the landscape, teaching Cross to track animals for miles without ever alerting them to his presence. By the age of 12, Cross could identify wind shifts by the way leaves twisted on their stems, using those subtle signs to avoid carrying his scent toward wary deer that fled at the faintest hint of danger. The rifle his family kept was old, unreliable, and expensive to feed with ammunition, so most of his early hunting relied completely on homemade bows crafted from whatever materials they could salvage or trade. His father insisted that the bow taught discipline the rifle could not, because every shot required a deep understanding of distance, breath control, and tension rather than mechanical force or loud intimidation. In long, cold winters, Cross spent hours carving bow limbs out of layered woods, smoothing them with patience until they flexed evenly without cracking under strain. He practiced fletching arrows with clipped turkey feathers, learning which patterns stabilized flight and which ones caused unpredictable spirals that missed by yards. These quiet rituals gradually shaped a skill set that relied less on power and more on precision, shaping Cross into someone who understood the subtle mechanics of silence better than anyone he would eventually serve alongside. When he enlisted, Cross assumed those skills would become nothing more than background trivia, overshadowed by the harsh structure of military drills and weapon qualifications. The Army taught him to fire the M1 rifle in disciplined volleys, to clear rooms with quick bursts, and to trust the undeniable authority of modern firepower. Yet deep down, he sensed the disconnect between the battlefield he trained for and the one he had grown up understanding, because the wild had taught him that noise created vulnerability while silence forged opportunity. Most of his fellow recruits came from cities or towns where shooting ranges and paved streets shaped their understanding of conflict. But Cross viewed every environment through the lens of scent, shadow, and wind. He noticed details that others ignored, such as how loose soil near the edge of a tent revealed nighttime movement, or how birds suddenly falling silent meant something more dangerous than a passing breeze. These instincts, dismissed as quirks during training, now resurfaced with unmistakable importance as he evaluated the silent warfare unfolding around him. His injured right hand reminded him painfully of another lesson his father had ingrained. Adaptability mattered more than strength, because the wilderness never adjusted to a hunter's limitations. When Cross discovered he could no longer hold his rifle for extended periods, he returned instinctively to the tool that required finesse rather than brute force, shaping his bowstring with waxed thread and refining his grip until the pain became manageable. The Army had not trained him to fight without gunfire, but his upbringing had, and the memory of quiet hunts through snow-covered woods gave him confidence, even as the men around him succumbed to fear. The more he watched the platoon struggle with the constraints of doctrine, the more he understood that his unusual past might be the only advantage they possessed in a battle defined by silence. His skill was not something he learned in a classroom or on a firing range. It had grown from years of necessity, shaped by a landscape that punished noise and rewarded those who moved unseen. As the threat of the German Commandos tightened around the hedgerows, Cross recognized that his upbringing had prepared him for a kind of warfare none of his fellow soldiers had ever imagined, setting the stage for a decision that would change the fate of the entire platoon. Cross's decision to bring his handmade bow into an active combat zone began as a quiet act of desperation, but it gradually transformed into a deliberate, calculated rejection of the military doctrine that had failed to adapt to the unforgiving complexity of the hedgerow battlefield. Late that evening, while the rest of the platoon cleaned rifles and whispered nervously about the previous night's disappearances, he sat beneath a dim lantern behind the supply tent, inspecting the laminated limbs of his bow with the same careful attention a gunsmith gave to a precision rifle. The weapon looked primitive compared to the polished steel surrounding him, yet every curve, joint, and grain pattern carried the knowledge of years spent hunting in silence. He ran his fingers along the bowstring, feeling a slight roughness, where the fibers had begun to fray from repeated tension, then unwound a strip of waxed thread and rewound the serving with steady, practiced movements that soothed the unease twisting in his stomach. While the army demanded conformity, the quiet resistance in his hands reminded him that survival often depended on the willingness to abandon predictable methods and embrace tools that matched the terrain rather than the rulebook. The wax sealed the fibers perfectly, creating a smooth, controlled release that reduced noise and stabilized each shot with consistent precision. Beside him lay a small bundle of arrows he had spent the afternoon repairing, each fitted with short steel tips he had ground down using a file borrowed from the mechanics. He shortened the fletching to reduce wind drag and trimmed the shafts to improve maneuverability in tight spaces, crafting a projectile designed not for maximum penetration, but for reliable accuracy at close to medium ranges inside the hedgerow labyrinth. No firearm manual mentioned the use of such weapons, yet Cross trusted the physics he understood intuitively. Low flight arc, minimal vibration, and zero muzzle flash made the bow uniquely suited for silent engagements where gunfire guaranteed exposure. Before long, the sound of distant boots approached, and one of his squadmates crouched beside him, staring at the bow with disbelief and a hint of curiosity. The soldier whispered that command would never approve such an unconventional weapon, suggesting Cross abandon the idea before he got himself reprimanded or worse. Cross simply continued smoothing the bowstring, answering with a calm steadiness that surprised even himself, explaining that no amount of official authorization mattered if the enemy was already exploiting every loophole in standard procedures. The soldier left without further objection, leaving Cross alone with his thoughts and the unnerving sense that the boundary between innovation and insubordination had become dangerously thin. As night settled across the camp, he tightened a leather grip around the bow's handle, securing it with a small metal clamp he had fashioned from a broken radio bracket. The modification allowed him to compensate for the reduced strength in his injured right hand, distributing tension more evenly and improving control during rapid draw cycles. He tested the adjustment repeatedly, pulling the bowstring back until his shoulder trembled, then releasing it slowly while listening for imperfections in the limb resonance that could betray his location during an ambush. Hours later, after finishing the final adjustments, he stood at the edge of the hedgerow and aimed into the dark corridor of tangled branches, imagining the path an arrow would take through the twisting shadows. For the first time since the Commandos began stalking the perimeter, he felt aligned with the environment rather than at war with it, sensing how the bow connected seamlessly with the terrain's natural silence. The weapon, crude by modern standards, yet perfectly adapted to the moment, offered a rare advantage the enemy could neither anticipate nor counter without exposing themselves. Cross understood the risks inherent in abandoning the manual's demands, recognizing that one mistake could end his life and jeopardize his squad, but he also recognized the greater danger in continuing to rely on tactics the enemy had already dismantled. As he lowered the bow and stepped back into camp, he carried with him the calm certainty that his unconventional choice represented not foolish rebellion, but necessary adaptation. In that quiet conviction, the first seeds of a strategy formed one that would soon transform him from a worried soldier into the silent threat the German commandos never expected. The first real test of Cross's silent weapon came shortly after midnight, when the fog thickened over the hedgerows and the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional click of a shifting rifle strap or the distant rumble of artillery far beyond the tree line. Cross had volunteered for the outer sentry position, knowing the isolation would give him the freedom to act without immediate scrutiny, yet fully aware that the responsibility also placed him directly in the path of whatever the German commandos planned next. He positioned himself near a narrow gap in the hedge, crouching behind a low cluster of wild brambles, letting the darkness swallow him as he steadied his breathing and listened for disturbances too subtle for most soldiers to detect. Minutes passed slowly, stretching into a tense silence filled with the soft rustling of leaves brushing one another in the light wind, until Cross detected a faint, deliberate whisper of movement that immediately tightened every muscle in his body. The sound was not chaotic like an animal's scurry, but purposeful and controlled, betraying the presence of someone trained to move silently through difficult terrain. He gripped his bow gently, careful not to let the tension of his fingers produce even the smallest creak, then nocked an arrow with practiced precision that felt eerily natural despite the looming threat inches beyond the darkness. His instincts sharpened as a solitary German commando stepped into the narrow clearing, his silhouette barely visible against the shifting gray fog that clung to the lower brush. The man scanned the perimeter with a calmness that suggested experience, moving with a slow, predatory confidence that seemed designed to unsettle any sentry who might be watching from the shadows. Cross watched the soldier pause near the hedgerow, unaware of the silent eyes tracking his every movement, and recognized instantly that firing a rifle would have exposed his position and drawn others from nearby patrols. Instead, Cross inhaled deeply, anchoring his focus on the steady rhythm of his heartbeat while raising the bow into a smooth, practiced alignment that stretched his injured hand but did not overpower it. The quiet tension of the drawn string created a fragile pocket of stillness around him, as if the entire hedgerow was waiting for the decision he was about to make. The commando took another step forward, stooping slightly to inspect a section of disturbed soil that likely marked the path of an earlier American patrol, unaware that he had wandered directly into a line of fire no textbook could have predicted. Cross released the arrow with a controlled exhale, sending it slicing through the fog with a barely audible hiss that vanished almost instantly in the damp air. The steel tip struck the commando cleanly at the base of the neck, cutting off any chance of a cry and dropping the man to his knees before he toppled soundlessly onto the soft ground. Cross remained perfectly still, resisting the instinct to retreat or reposition, knowing that unnecessary movement could betray him to any hidden companions still lurking nearby. He listened intensely for several seconds, waiting for the telltale crack of a twig or the hushed rustle of footsteps that might signal retaliation, yet the forest offered nothing except the steady rustling of cold wind moving through the hedges. He finally approached the fallen commando with careful, measured steps, examining the man's uniform and confirming that the enemy had been operating alone, likely scouting for a weakness before signaling his team to advance. The realization struck him with an unsettling clarity. If he had fired his rifle, the noise would have carried through the hedgerows and drawn the remaining commandos onto his position within moments. The bow had not only saved his life, but prevented a larger attack that could have overwhelmed the camp before dawn, proving its worth in a single silent heartbeat. When Cross returned to his post, the weight of the moment settled across his thoughts, blending relief with a sobering recognition that the battle ahead would demand this level of precision again and again. His silent kill had shifted something fundamental inside him, crystallizing the understanding that his unconventional weapon was not an eccentric gamble but a necessary adaptation to the brutal realities of a battlefield where noise meant death. In that quiet space between fear and resolve, Cross realized that the first arrow had marked not an ending but the beginning of a new, shadowed role he alone was prepared to fill. The morning after Cross's first silent kill, the camp awoke to a strange tension that lingered beneath every whispered conversation. Because although no gunfire had echoed across the hedgerows, every soldier sensed that something violent had transpired under the cover of darkness. Cross remained silent about what he had done, choosing instead to observe the subtle shift in the Germans' behavior, as fresh boot prints appeared near the gap in the foliage, suggesting the commandos had noticed their missing scout and begun searching the area more aggressively. The absence of a body or audible conflict unsettled them, forcing their patrols to move with heightened caution that resembled the behavior of predators, suddenly uncertain whether they were still the hunters or had become the hunted. By late afternoon, a pair of commandos crept close to the perimeter, slipping through the brush with a quiet discipline that revealed their experience, but Cross intercepted them from a hidden position he had carefully selected after studying how the hedgerow funneled sound and visibility. He waited patiently as the two men positioned themselves near a narrow junction between the paths, then released 2 arrows in measured succession, each finding its mark without alerting anyone beyond the immediate clearing. Their bodies fell into the damp grass without a single cry, and Cross dragged them deeper into the shadows, denying the Germans any evidence that their numbers were steadily diminishing. The following day brought an escalation that challenged even Cross's instincts, because the Germans responded by splitting into smaller cells that roamed unpredictably between the hedgerows, searching for clues to explain the growing number of disappearances. These teams moved with admirable precision, maintaining lines of sight and alternating hand signals that allowed them to cover each other despite the claustrophobic terrain, yet their very coordination became a weakness when they attempted to sweep a narrow ridge where Cross had positioned himself hours earlier. With methodical calm, he waited for the group to align unknowingly along a converging path, then targeted the rearmost soldier to avoid alerting the others, pulling him silently into the brush before repeating the process until the remaining men retreated in confusion. As dusk settled on the fourth day, the Commandos abandoned their cautious approach and began laying traps designed to corner any hidden threat, attaching thin wires to trip grenades, and planting steel stakes that forced movement through narrow channels they could monitor. Cross studied these new obstacles with a mixture of concern and determination, understanding that every adaptation they made required an equally nimble response to preserve the fragile advantage he had created. Instead of confronting them directly, he used the traps as markers, navigating around the most dangerous corridors until he found a vantage point that overlooked a small, makeshift rally point where 4 Commandos regrouped before resuming their search. From this elevated position, Cross delivered 3 precise shots that struck before the men could register what had happened, sending them collapsing into the muddy earth with nothing more than a faint rustle in the leaves. The remaining commando fled into the shadows, shouting a warning that echoed too late to provide any meaningful protection, and Cross withdrew quickly, knowing the Germans would scour the ridge in retaliation. His escape through a narrow game trail reinforced the essential rule his father had taught him long ago. The forest protects only those who understand its rhythms and move with its silence rather than against it. By the 5th night, the Commandos had grown visibly agitated, abandoning some of their stealth in favor of rapid, sweeping patrols that revealed the growing desperation beneath their training. Their flashlights sliced through the darkness in frantic, erratic arcs, cutting across the hedgerows as they searched for an enemy they could neither hear nor predict, while their terse whispers hinted at frustration no longer contained by discipline. Cross used their agitation to his advantage, following the shifting patterns of their patrols until he identified the weakest link in their rotation, then dispatching another pair with swift, calculated strikes that further destabilized their shrinking confidence. On the 6th day, heavy rain rolled across Normandy, soaking the hedgerows and turning the soft earth into a treacherous mixture of mud and slick foliage that muffled footsteps but complicated every movement. The storm emboldened the Germans, who believed the downpour would drown out the sounds of their advance and give them a chance to corner the elusive threat haunting their ranks. Yet the rain only strengthened Cross's advantage, concealing the gentle whisper of his bowstring and silencing the impact of his arrows as he eliminated the last 5 Commandos during a tense confrontation near a shallow ravine. Their bodies crumpled quietly in the rain, swallowed by the muddied earth before anyone could witness the final moments of the hunt. As the storm faded into a cold, dripping haze, Cross realized that the enemy had finally run out of men to send against him, their once formidable presence now reduced to silent forms, hidden beneath the hedgerows they once dominated. The 6 days of relentless pursuit had inverted the balance of fear, transforming him from a vulnerable soldier into a quiet force the Commandos could neither track nor understand. And for the first time since the infiltration began, the camp slept under a night sky, free from the oppressive sense of eyes watching from the dark. Despite the growing success of his silent campaign, Cross could feel the hidden cost of each engagement accumulating within him like a slow, grinding pressure that settled deeper into his bones with every arrow he released. The relentless focus required to stalk and eliminate highly trained Commandos left him operating in a constant state of heightened vigilance, draining his energy so thoroughly that even the simple act of standing still sometimes made his knees tremble from exhaustion. Each night he lay awake, listening to the rhythmic drip of dew collecting on the canvas tents, replaying the silent kills in his mind, and wondering whether the next encounter would expose a mistake he had not yet realized he was capable of making. His injured right hand, though partially stabilized by the custom wrap he fashioned around the bow's grip, continued to flare with sharp bursts of pain whenever he drew the string too quickly or held tension for longer than a few seconds. The swelling occasionally forced him to pause mid-draw, lowering the bow and flexing his fingers until the stiffness eased enough for another attempt. The injury reminded him daily that he was operating at the edge of his physical endurance, fighting not only an enemy trained to kill silently, but also the limitations of his own failing body, which grew more resistant to his demands with each passing hour. One evening, after eliminating a particularly aggressive pair of Commandos, Cross returned to camp and found Corporal Jensen sitting against a supply crate with blood seeping through the bandages wrapped around his thigh. Jensen had stumbled into a concealed wire trap while attempting to reinforce the perimeter, and the resulting explosion of shrapnel had torn into his leg before anyone could warn him. Cross knelt beside him, feeling a crushing weight of guilt settle in his chest, because while his silent war was saving lives, it also forced the rest of the platoon into increasingly hazardous positions they were never trained to navigate. Jensen tried to speak, but his voice cracked under the strain, revealing the fear he fought desperately to hide from the others. The incident haunted Cross as he replayed the preceding hours, wondering whether he had missed signs of enemy movement that might have prevented his friend's injury. He pondered whether his solitary methods had inadvertently pulled resources away from other areas of the perimeter, creating vulnerabilities that the Germans had quickly exploited. No one blamed him directly, yet the uncomfortable silence in the camp that evening suggested that the platoon understood the complexity of the situation without knowing how to articulate their concerns. The quiet glances exchanged between soldiers revealed the growing awareness that survival required actions outside their control, actions only Cross seemed capable of performing. The emotional toll intensified during a late-night patrol when Cross briefly misjudged the angle of a narrow path and slipped on a slick patch of mud, causing his bow to strike a concealed root that nearly snapped one of the carefully laminated limbs. The momentary shock of the impact sent panic surging through him, because without the bow, he knew he would be forced to rely on the same noisy tactics the Commandos easily predicted. As his heart hammered in his chest, he examined the damage under a faint sliver of moonlight, relieved to discover only a minor dent that could be repaired with careful sanding and reinforced binding. The close call nevertheless reminded him how fragile his advantage truly was, balanced precariously on handmade tools and wounded hands. Through these long and grueling days, Cross increasingly struggled with the psychological burden of taking so many lives in absolute silence, a responsibility that stripped away the emotional distance usually provided by the thunder of gunfire or the chaotic flash of open combat. Each kill reminded him of the quiet hunts he had undertaken as a boy, but the stakes were infinitely higher now, measured not in survival for the winter, but in the lives of the men who depended on him to keep the shadows at bay. The memory of their trust weighed heavily, pressing into his thoughts until he sometimes wished he could retreat to the simplicity of the mountains where silence meant peace instead of death. The hardest moment came when he discovered one of the younger privates sitting alone near the tree line, trembling as he confessed that he could no longer sleep, knowing enemy infiltrators might appear without warning. The private admitted he felt useless compared to Cross's eerie effectiveness, a sentiment that struck Cross deeper than any wound he had suffered. He understood that his actions, while necessary, had shifted the unit's morale in complex ways, creating both relief and unease, as the men struggled to reconcile his unconventional methods with the harsh reality of their situation. As Cross placed a reassuring hand on the young soldier's shoulder, he recognized that the true cost of silent warfare extended far beyond injured limbs or sleepless nights. It reached into the minds of every man in the platoon, reshaping their understanding of danger, survival, and dependence in ways they had never imagined before stepping into the hedgerows of Normandy. And in that heavy realization, Cross felt the full weight of the human toll settle around him like the dense morning fog, inescapable, unspoken, and irrevocably tied to every arrow he had released. On the sixth night, just as the last traces of daylight vanished behind the thick canopy of hedgerows, a cold, relentless rain swept across the countryside, turning the ground into a slick carpet of mud that swallowed every careless footprint and muffled nearly all ambient noise. Cross sensed immediately that the storm offered both danger and opportunity, because while the rain concealed movement more effectively than any deliberate stealth technique, it also encouraged the remaining German commandos to search boldly for the silent hunter who had decimated their ranks during the previous days. Their desperation, sharpened by fear and mounting confusion, created a volatile tension that pulsed through the hedgerows like a living presence waiting to erupt. He moved through the soaked underbrush with deliberate caution, testing each step before shifting his weight, aware that even a small slip could betray his position to the enemy, now scouring the perimeter with renewed aggression. The storm distorted sound in unpredictable ways, causing distant splashes to seem close, and nearby whispers to fade instantly into the wet air, forcing Cross to rely almost entirely on visual cues and instinctive recognition of movement. His bow felt heavier than usual in his tired hands, the soaked leather grip threatening to slip despite the firm wrap he had reinforced earlier that afternoon. Somewhere ahead, he detected a faint wavering glimmer, brief flashes from small tactical lanterns the Germans used to coordinate during heavy weather, their soft glow revealing three silhouettes crouched near a washed-out trench. These last commandos appeared more agitated than their predecessors, shifting anxiously as they attempted to orient themselves against the relentless rain, clearly aware that they were running out of time to neutralize the unseen threat stalking them. Cross steadied his breathing, lowering himself behind a twisted cluster of dripping branches, and studied their formation until he identified